"Ma'am, the catering entrance is around the back." The sentence cut through the cold Manhattan air with the kind of polished cruelty only expensive places could produce. Naomi Brooks stopped just short of the velvet rope, the sharp glow of camera flashes reflecting across the black marble beneath her heels. For a moment, nobody moved. The doorman stood tall in his tailored navy coat, one white-gloved hand stretched politely toward the side alley beside the Grand Lexington Hotel, while a line of wealthy guests drifted past Naomi without even pretending not to stare. A woman wrapped in diamonds glanced at Naomi's dark satin gown, then looked away with a faint smirk curling at the edge of her lipstick. Somewhere near the red carpet entrance, laughter rose beneath the warm sound of a jazz quartet floating through hidden speakers. Naomi said nothing. She simply lifted her eyes toward the massive gold letters above the ballroom entrance. Whitmore Biotech Annual Gala. The rain from earlier still clung to the sidewalks outside, turning the streets silver beneath the city lights. Black SUVs lined the curb for nearly half a block, while photographers shouted celebrity names into the night. Naomi adjusted the cuff of her coat slowly, calmly, as though she had all the time in the world. The security guard cleared his throat. "Miss, staff check-in is through the service hall." His tone remained professional, but the meaning underneath it landed hard enough to freeze the air around them. Naomi looked at him for a long second. Not angry, not embarrassed, just quiet. The kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable. Behind her, another guest stepped onto the carpet, a white senator with silver hair and a woman young enough to be his daughter hanging from his arm. The photographers exploded with flashes again. Nobody noticed Naomi move aside. Nobody cared. That was the thing about rooms built on money. Certain people became invisible before they even walked through the door. Naomi finally reached into her purse and removed a single black invitation embossed with gold lettering. The guard took it carefully, still unconvinced. His eyes moved from the card to Naomi and back again. Something uncertain flickered across his face. Before he could speak, another voice entered smoothly from behind him. "Problem here." Richard Whitmore descended the hotel steps surrounded by executives and board members, his tuxedo sharp beneath the chandelier lights spilling from the ballroom entrance. At 63, he carried himself like a man who believed entire cities existed to make him richer. Conversations nearby softened the moment he appeared. People smiled harder around him. Straighter, smaller. The guard immediately handed over the invitation. Richard barely glanced at it before his eyes landed on Naomi. There was a pause. Tiny, almost invisible. Then came the smile. Cold, polished, dangerous. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said lightly. "Tonight's event is private." Several executives behind him chuckled under their breath. Naomi met his gaze without blinking. Wind swept through the avenue, tugging lightly at the loose strands of hair near her face, while yellow taxi lights slid across the wet pavement below. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled softly beyond the skyscrapers. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. "These galas can be confusing," he continued, "especially for people unfamiliar with this world. More laughter. Softer this time. Controlled." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the invitation card, though her expression never changed. She looked past Richard toward the glowing ballroom beyond him, where crystal chandeliers shimmered like frozen fire across the ceiling. Politicians, investors, old money families, every powerful person in Manhattan packed into one room, waiting to celebrate Whitmore Biotech's biggest quarter in company history. None of them knew the truth yet. None of them knew that 72 hours earlier, while they were sipping champagne and praising Richard Whitmore on financial television, Naomi Brooks had quietly purchased enough shares to own controlling interest in the company standing behind him. And none of them realized the woman they were trying to send through the service entrance was about to walk into that ballroom as their new owner. Naomi stepped past the velvet rope without another word. The sound of live piano drifting through the ballroom doors as the warmth of the hotel wrapped around her like a second atmosphere. The Grand Lexington smelled faintly of polished wood, expensive perfume, and old money preserved behind crystal and gold leaf. Servers carrying silver trays moved carefully between clusters of executives while cameras flashed near the stage at the center of the room. Every surface reflected light. Every smile looked rehearsed. Naomi handed her coat to the attendant near the entrance and ignored the hesitation in the young woman's eyes when she saw the name on the claim ticket. Brooks. The attendant forced a smile a second too late. Naomi had seen that expression her entire life. She moved deeper into the ballroom calmly, heels gliding across the marble floor while conversations softened around her in subtle waves. Not silence. Worse, observation. People noticed her because she did not fit the picture they expected inside rooms like this. Her dress was elegant but understated, matte black silk without diamonds or designer logos. No security detail, no entourage, no husband beside her. Just a tall black woman walking alone through a sea of wealth built to exclude people like her politely instead of openly. A waiter passed with champagne flutes balanced perfectly on a silver tray. Naomi took one without breaking stride. Across the ballroom, giant digital screens displayed Whitmore Biotech's stock performance climbing upward beside Richard Whitmore's smiling portrait. The future of American innovation. Naomi looked at the image for a long moment before turning away. 23 years earlier, her father had stood inside another Whitmore building 15 blocks downtown, carrying a cardboard box filled with framed photos and office papers after being forced out of the company he helped build. Harold Brooks had been one of Whitmore Biotech's top financial analysts before he discovered hidden debt buried inside offshore accounts connected to one of Richard's acquisitions. He reported it internally because he believed honesty still mattered in corporate America. 3 weeks later, he lost his position. 6 months later, nobody in Manhattan would hire him. Naomi still remembered the smell of rain on his coat the night he came home after his final interview rejection. She had been 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table beside stacks of overdue bills while her mother reheated canned soup on the stove. Harold never raised his voice, never cursed. He just loosened his tie slowly and stared out the apartment window at the city skyline, glowing beyond Harlem. Some rooms were never built for us, baby, he told her quietly that night. So one day, build your own. Naomi blinked once, returning to the present as applause suddenly erupted near the ballroom stage. Richard Whitmore climbed the platform beside a line of politicians and investors while cameras flashed bright enough to wash the room in white light. His silver tuxedo cufflinks caught the glow as he waved confidently to the crowd. People adored men like Richard because they confused power with greatness. Naomi sipped her champagne slowly, expression unreadable. Near the back of the ballroom, 2 board members stood beside a towering floral arrangement, whispering low enough that most guests ignored them completely. Naomi did not. The layoffs have to happen before Q4, one muttered. Once the merger clears, nobody will care. The other nodded nervously. What about the pension exposure? Buried in the restructuring package. Naomi's eyes lifted slightly. There it was. The same kind of deception that destroyed her father all those years ago. Different decade. Same people. Same arrogance. One of the executives suddenly noticed her standing nearby and lowered his voice immediately. His polite smile returned too quickly. Beautiful event tonight, is it not? Naomi held his gaze for half a second longer than comfort allowed. Beautiful things are usually the most expensive, she replied softly. Then she walked away, leaving the man strangely unsettled as the ballroom lights dimmed for Richard Whitmore's keynote speech. The ballroom lights softened into a warm amber glow as Richard Whitmore stepped behind the glass podium at center stage, and within seconds the entire room shifted around him like metal bending toward a magnet. Conversations faded. Crystal glasses lowered. Even the servers slowed their movements between tables as giant digital screens illuminated his face 30 feet high above the crowd. Tonight, Richard announced smoothly, his voice deep and practiced through hidden speakers, we celebrate another year of American innovation, resilience, and leadership. Applause thundered instantly across the ballroom. Naomi stood near the back beside a towering column wrapped in white orchids, her untouched champagne resting lightly between her fingers while she watched the room worship him. Richard knew exactly how to command wealthy people. He spoke slowly enough to sound thoughtful, confidently enough to sound untouchable. The kind of man financial networks called visionary because nobody powerful ever challenged him publicly. Whitmore Biotech, he continued, is not simply a company. It is legacy. More applause followed. Naomi's eyes moved across the audience instead. Governors, investors, corporate attorneys, media executives. most of them white. Most of them born into circles where people like Naomi entered through side doors, if they entered at all. Near the front row, Claire Whitmore leaned elegantly against her chair in a silver gown that shimmered beneath the chandelier light like crushed diamonds. Her smile never fully reached her eyes. She whispered something to the woman beside her, then glanced toward Naomi again. The woman turned immediately, looking Naomi over from head to toe before hiding a smirk behind her wine glass. Naomi looked away first, not because she felt smaller, but because she understood something they did not. In rooms built on ego, silence made people reveal themselves faster than confrontation ever could. Richard shifted the presentation behind him to projected earnings charts climbing across the giant screens. Our merger with Novartis Global, he announced proudly, will position Whitmore Biotech at the forefront of the next decade. Another wave of applause rolled through the ballroom. Naomi's expression changed almost invisibly. There it was again. The merger. The same one the executives had whispered about earlier. A waiter carrying a tray of lobster hors d'oeuvres brushed past Naomi carefully. She stepped aside and continued watching the numbers displayed overhead. Debt ratios hidden inside inflated growth projections. Pension liabilities buried beneath offshore restructuring agreements. Richard was selling confidence while standing on a collapsing floor. And somehow nobody in the room either saw it or wanted to. A voice interrupted beside her. You seem very interested in the financials. Naomi turned slightly. A tall man in his 40s stood nearby holding a whiskey glass against his chest, his tuxedo slightly less extravagant than the others surrounding him. Daniel Ross, Chief Financial Officer. Naomi recognized him instantly from investor reports. Unlike Richard, Daniel looked tired in a real way. Not physically. Morally. Should I not be? Naomi asked calmly. Daniel studied her for a moment. Most gala guests care more about the dessert menu than debt exposure. Naomi almost smiled. Almost. On stage, Richard continued speaking about innovation, growth, and the future while another standing ovation spread through the ballroom. Daniel glanced toward the screen displaying Whitmore Biotech's projected merger valuation. People hear confidence, he said quietly. They stop asking questions. Naomi looked toward him fully now. And when nobody asks questions, she replied softly, people like Richard become dangerous. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Before he could answer, Claire Whitmore suddenly approached from across the ballroom, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Several nearby guests immediately straightened as she arrived beside them, carrying herself with the effortless entitlement of someone who had never once doubted she belonged in every room she entered. Her gaze landed directly on Naomi. Cold, curious, calculating. Richard is about to greet the investors personally, Claire said politely, though her tone carried no warmth at all. I do not believe we have met. Naomi extended her hand calmly. Naomi Brooks. Claire looked at the hand for a fraction too long before finally shaking it lightly. Brooks, she repeated. Interesting. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Daniel. Then back to Naomi's dress, her face, her presence. And which division are you with? The question hung there beneath the chandelier light like a blade wrapped in velvet. Naomi held Claire Whitmore's gaze without rushing to answer. The low hum of conversation and clinking crystal glasses folding around them beneath the chandelier light. Daniel remained still beside them, one hand resting against his whiskey glass, while several nearby executives subtly slowed their conversations to listen. Claire smiled politely, but there was calculation beneath it now, the kind rich people perfected after years of deciding who belonged in their world and who did not. Which division are you with? Tables, she answered. Some people learn finance because they inherit wealth. Others learn because losing money means losing electricity. Daniel stared at her differently now. Not socially, intellectually. On stage, Richard raised a champagne glass while cameras flashed around him. To the future, he declared proudly. Applause swept through the ballroom again. Naomi watched the crowd cheer for a future built on numbers they had not bothered to question. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice. You are making some very bold assumptions for someone standing in a room she was not invited into properly. Naomi's expression remained calm. Actually, she said softly, I was invited. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel interrupted first. The pension issue she mentioned, he said carefully, is confidential. Naomi looked at him evenly. No, she corrected. It is hidden. There is a difference. Daniel said nothing after that. The silence stretched long enough for nearby guests to begin noticing tension beneath the polished surface of the conversation. One investor glanced over. Then another. Claire sensed it too. Her smile returned immediately, colder now. Well, she said brightly, lifting her champagne flute. Whitmore Biotech has no shortage of critics lately, especially online. Everybody suddenly believes they are an expert. Naomi's eyes shifted briefly toward Claire's diamond bracelet, catching the ballroom light. Confidence without accountability usually ends badly, she replied. History proves that. Before Claire could answer, Richard Whitmore himself approached through the crowd surrounded by board members and media executives. The room subtly bent around him again as people stepped aside, smiling too quickly. Claire, Richard said warmly before noticing Naomi standing beside them. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Ah, he said. We have met already. Naomi nodded once. At the front entrance. Daniel glanced between them carefully now, sensing something beneath the surface he could not fully place. Richard adjusted his tuxedo jacket and smiled the way powerful men smiled before dismissing someone publicly without appearing. Rude. I trust security got everything sorted out. Eventually, Naomi answered. Richard chuckled lightly, as if they were sharing a harmless misunderstanding. These events can be chaotic. Naomi looked directly at him. Only when people mistake appearance for authority. The sentence landed quietly between them, but Daniel's grip tightened slightly around his glass. Claire's eyes narrowed. Richard's smile held for another second too long. Then he laughed again, louder this time, inviting nearby guests to join him. Several did immediately, though uncertainly. Richard leaned closer toward Naomi beneath the warm chandelier glow. Tell me something, he said smoothly. Who exactly do you think you are? Naomi met his gaze without blinking once. Someone who knows your merger is about to fail. The laughter around them disappeared almost instantly. The silence after Naomi's words spread slowly through the ballroom like cold water beneath a locked door. For one strange second, even the music seemed quieter. Richard Whitmore stared at her with the practiced smile of a man trying not to look challenged in front of people whose approval fed his power. Around them, several nearby executives shifted awkwardly while pretending not to listen. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to lips. Nobody moved first. Richard finally laughed, smooth and controlled, though the sound carried an edge now. That is a very serious accusation coming from someone whose name does not appear anywhere on tonight's investor list. A few people nearby chuckled immediately, eager to follow his lead. Claire folded her arms lightly beside him, satisfaction flickering across her face as she watched the attention turning toward Naomi. Richard stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal while making certain everyone around them could still hear every word. You know, he said, confidence can be dangerous when it is not supported by experience. Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him beneath the golden ballroom light, while distant camera flashes reflected across the marble columns surrounding them. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. Powerful men often did. This merger, he continued proudly, gesturing toward the glowing financial projections overhead, was built by some of the most respected minds in American business. Naomi glanced briefly toward the giant screens. Then they should have noticed the exposure buried inside the pension transfers. Daniel Ross lowered his whiskey glass entirely now. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly before the smile returned again. I think, Claire interrupted lightly, we have entertained this conversation long enough. Her eyes swept toward Naomi's simple black dress again before returning upward with elegant dismissal. These galas attract all kinds of people hoping to feel important for one evening. Several guests nearby laughed more openly this time. Naomi heard every bit of it. The polished mockery, the carefully hidden contempt, the assumption that a black woman standing alone in a ballroom like this could only belong there accidentally. Across the room, one of the television reporters had begun subtly pointing her camera toward the growing tension near the stage. Richard noticed immediately. His expression sharpened. He could tolerate disagreement privately. Public embarrassment was different. Miss Brooks, he said calmly, though his voice had gone colder now. I believe it would be best if you enjoyed the remainder of the evening elsewhere. Naomi held his gaze. Because I am wrong? She asked softly. Richard smiled again. Because this is a private event. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside them. Richard, he began carefully. The concerns she raised about the restructuring package are not entirely. Richard cut him off instantly, without even looking at him. Not tonight, Daniel. The sentence landed harder than shouting would have. Daniel fell silent. Naomi noticed. So did everyone else. Richard turned back toward Naomi with polished patience that barely concealed irritation underneath. You have made your point, he said. Now I am asking respectfully. 2 security staff near the ballroom entrance had already begun moving closer. Not aggressively. Quietly. The kind of removal wealthy institutions perfected over decades. Make the unwanted person disappear without disturbing the atmosphere. Naomi watched them approach from the corner of her eye. Her face never changed. Claire lifted her champagne flute delicately. Some people, she said softly enough to sound conversational, confuse being invited into a room with belonging there. The comment drew another ripple of restrained laughter from nearby investors. Naomi looked around the ballroom slowly then. The chandeliers, the million-dollar smiles, the executives applauding a company built on hidden corruption. The same type of room that destroyed her father while congratulating itself for integrity afterward. Richard nodded subtly toward security. Please escort Miss Brooks out professionally. One of the guards approached carefully. Ma'am, he said quietly, almost apologetically, if you would come with me. Naomi finally set her untouched champagne flute onto a passing tray with a soft clink of crystal against silver. The tiny sound somehow cut through the ballroom louder than Richard's entire speech. She smoothed one sleeve of her black dress calmly, then looked directly at Richard Whitmore one last time. You should have listened, she said softly. Richard smiled with visible relief now that control was returning to the room. And you, he replied, should have learned that not every table is meant for everybody. Naomi said nothing after that. She simply turned and walked toward the balcony doors while hundreds of wealthy strangers watched her leave beneath the warm glow of chandeliers, and the cold comfort of believing power still belonged to them. The balcony doors closed softly behind Naomi, muting the ballroom into a distant blur of music and applause. Outside, the night air wrapped around her cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain drifting between the Manhattan towers. 30 floors below, traffic crawled through the city in ribbons of white and red light, while reflections shimmered across the wet pavement like broken glass. Naomi stepped toward the edge of the balcony slowly, one hand resting against the cold stone railing as wind tugged gently at the loose strands of hair near her face. Inside, Richard Whitmore was probably already recovering the room with another speech, another joke, another performance polished enough to erase what had just happened. Men like Richard survived because people needed to believe confidence meant competence. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere far below, a siren echoed through the city before fading into the distance. The sounds of New York never truly stopped. Neither did memory. She could still see her father sitting at that tiny apartment kitchen table years ago, sleeves rolled halfway up his arms, old reading glasses low on his nose while stacks of financial documents covered every inch of the surface. Naomi had been 16 then, studying beside him under flickering yellow light while snow tapped softly against the apartment windows. Harold Brooks used to circle suspicious numbers in red ink with the kind of focus some people reserved for prayer. Always follow what people try hardest to hide, he once told her quietly. That is where truth lives. Naomi looked down at the city skyline, glowing beneath the clouds. Her father died 3 years after Whitmore forced him out. Stress collapsed him long before age did. No lawsuit, no apology, no headlines. Just another brilliant black man quietly erased from rooms he helped build. Behind Naomi, the balcony door opened again. She did not turn immediately. She already knew who it was from the slower footsteps. Daniel Ross stepped outside holding his whiskey glass loosely at his side, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned now, as if the ballroom itself had become difficult to breathe inside. For a moment he said nothing. Wind moved between them softly. You embarrassed him, Daniel finally said. Naomi kept her eyes on the city. No, she answered calmly. I interrupted his illusion. Daniel exhaled through his nose, almost laughing despite himself. The distant glow from Times Square reflected faintly against the glass towers surrounding them. You know, he said carefully, Most people in that room would kill for 5 minutes of Richard Whitmore's approval. Naomi turned toward him slightly. That is because most people in that room still believe proximity to power makes them powerful. Daniel studied her face in silence. There was no anger there. No desperation. Just stillness. That unsettled him more than outrage would have. Inside the ballroom, applause erupted again beyond the glass doors. Richard was speaking, performing, winning the room back. Daniel looked down at the amber liquid in his glass. The merger concerns you raised, he admitted quietly. They are not wrong. Naomi said nothing. Daniel glanced toward her again. The pension exposure is larger than what shareholders know. I know, Naomi replied softly. And Novaris knows too. That is why they delayed final signatures twice this month. Daniel stared at her fully now. How could you possibly know that? Naomi reached calmly into her purse and removed her phone. The screen illuminated briefly in the darkness between them. A single unread message glowed at the top. Final transfer confirmed. Control threshold achieved. Daniel frowned slightly, not understanding yet. Naomi locked the phone again before slipping it back into her purse. Because people like Richard always assume nobody outside their circle is paying attention, she said quietly. Wind swept harder across the balcony this time, carrying faint drops of rain against the stone railing. Daniel watched her differently now, less like a stranger, more like a question he had not realized needed answering. Inside, the ballroom lights brightened suddenly as Richard prepared for the final investor presentation of the night. Naomi looked through the glass doors toward the crowd gathering near the stage. Her reflection stared back at her faintly against the city lights behind her. Calm, steady, ready. What happens next? Daniel asked softly. Naomi's eyes never left the ballroom. The truth, she answered. When Naomi stepped back into the ballroom, the warmth hit her first. Golden light spilled across polished marble floors while the sound of applause rolled through the massive room in steady waves. Richard Whitmore stood center stage beneath towering digital screens. One hand lifted confidently as cameras flashed from every direction. The city's elite watched him with admiration polished over years of money and influence. Nobody noticed Naomi return at first. That changed 30 seconds later. Richard smiled broadly at the crowd, the giant screens behind him glowing with Whitmore Biotech's logo, suspended above projected merger numbers climbing skyward in bright blue graphs. The future belongs, he declared smoothly, to those bold enough to seize it. Another round of applause followed immediately. Then every screen in the ballroom flickered. Once, twice. The music cut out mid-note. Conversation stopped instinctively as the giant displays overhead shifted from blue presentation graphics to black corporate notification windows. A soft electronic tone echoed through hidden speakers. Nearby guests reached for their phones almost simultaneously. One vibration, then another, then dozens more. The sound spread across the ballroom like rainfall against glass. Naomi stopped near the rear entrance beside a marble column, calm beneath the shifting glow from the screens overhead. Daniel Ross stared down at his phone first. His face drained of color almost instantly. Across the ballroom, several board members exchanged confused looks while reading the same alert appearing simultaneously across investor accounts, media terminals, and financial networks nationwide. Richard frowned slightly, trying to maintain composure as the crowd's attention drifted away from him and upward toward the giant screens, now displaying a single line in sharp, white letters. Whitmore Biotech Majority Acquisition Complete. Silence settled heavily across the room. Then the next line appeared beneath it. Acquiring holder, Brooks Global Holdings. Richard stopped speaking entirely. A low murmur spread through the ballroom like electricity. Claire Whitmore looked around in visible confusion before grabbing the nearest investor's phone from his hand. Her expression changed the moment she read the confirmation herself. No, she whispered under her breath. That is impossible. Daniel lifted his eyes slowly toward Naomi, standing motionless near the back of the room. Suddenly, the entire evening rearranged itself inside his head. The warnings, the confidence, the stillness, the merger exposure. Richard noticed Daniel staring toward the rear entrance and followed his gaze. The moment his eyes found Naomi, something inside him visibly shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. The terrible kind. Around him, Reporters began speaking rapidly into phones while executives refreshed financial feeds with trembling fingers. The ballroom no longer sounded elegant. It sounded nervous. Richard stepped away from the podium at last, his polished confidence cracking beneath the weight of confusion spreading through the room. "There has been some misunderstanding," he announced sharply, though nobody was listening to him anymore. Because Naomi Brooks had already started walking forward. Her heels moved softly across the marble floor while hundreds of eyes followed her through the silent ballroom. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smirked. Guests who barely noticed her earlier stepped aside automatically as she passed. The chandeliers above reflected against the black satin of her dress, while giant corporate screens continued glowing overhead with her company's name repeated again and again across national financial alerts. Brooks Global Holdings. Brooks Global Holdings. Brooks Global Holdings. Richard stood frozen near the stage watching her approach. Claire's champagne glass trembled faintly in her hand. Daniel remained perfectly still beside the ballroom tables, unable to look away. Naomi reached the foot of the stage and stopped. For a moment, neither she nor Richard spoke. The silence became unbearable. Then one of the reporters near the front finally whispered the question everyone else was suddenly thinking. "Who is she?" Naomi lifted her eyes toward Richard calmly. "The majority shareholder," she answered softly. Across the ballroom, every phone vibrated again at exactly the same time. The ballroom remained completely still as Naomi stepped onto the stage beside Richard Whitmore, the towering digital screens above them continuing to display the acquisition notice in bright, white letters against black. Nobody touched their drinks anymore. Nobody smiled. The soft clinking of crystal and silverware that had filled the evening only minutes earlier had disappeared beneath the weight of collective disbelief. Richard stood frozen. Beside the podium, one hand still resting against the edge of the glass lectern as though he needed it to remain upright. For the first time all night, he looked old. Not physically, spiritually. The cameras that once pointed toward him had shifted entirely toward Naomi now. Reporters moved closer, near the front rows while executives whispered frantically over glowing phone screens. Claire Whitmore stared at Naomi with a look that no longer carried superiority, only shock. Naomi glanced once across the ballroom before turning calmly toward the microphone. She did not rush. She did not smile. The room quieted further somehow, as though every person inside instinctively understood they were about to witness something they would remember for years. Naomi adjusted the microphone slightly. "Good evening," she said softly. Her voice carried cleanly across the silent ballroom. "My name is Naomi Brooks." A few guests shifted awkwardly, embarrassed now by how many times they had ignored or dismissed her earlier that evening. Naomi looked briefly toward the giant screens behind her displaying Brooks Global Holdings across every financial network in America. 3 years ago, she continued calmly, my company began quietly purchasing undervalued biotech assets connected to hidden debt exposure inside Whitmore Biotech. Richard's jaw tightened. Naomi did not look at him yet. Most investors missed the warning signs because they trusted presentation over transparency. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. That mistake is expensive. Several board members lowered their heads immediately. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the podium. Tonight was supposed to celebrate leadership, she said. So let us talk honestly about what leadership looks like. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Even the wait staff near the walls had stopped moving entirely. Naomi finally turned toward Richard Whitmore. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just clarity. 23 years ago, she said quietly, a financial analyst named Harold Brooks warned this company about hidden liabilities buried inside offshore accounts. Richard's expression changed instantly. Recognition flickered across his face like lightning behind glass. Naomi saw it. He was ignored, she continued, then removed. Daniel Ross closed his eyes briefly as understanding finally settled fully over him. Naomi looked back toward the crowd. That man was my father. A wave of stunned silence swept through the ballroom. Claire's face paled beneath the chandelier light. Naomi's voice never rose. He believed integrity mattered more than access. He believed truth mattered more than comfort. She paused for one breath. This company punished him for that. Richard finally spoke, his voice rougher now. Naomi. She lifted one hand gently, stopping him without force. The movement alone silenced him completely. You taught this city that power belonged only to people born into rooms like this, she said softly. Tonight, the daughter of the man you erased now owns the company you built on his silence. No applause followed. None was needed. The truth itself had become heavier than sound. Naomi turned back toward the crowd. Effective immediately, she announced calmly. Brooks Global Holdings is canceling the planned workforce reductions tied to the Novaris restructuring. Several employees near the back visibly froze in disbelief. Pension protections will remain fully intact. Executive compensation packages tied to concealed liabilities are suspended pending review. Daniel stared at her with open astonishment now. Naomi continued. And beginning next quarter, Whitmore Biotech will fund a national scholarship initiative for Black students entering finance, biotechnology, and corporate law. For the first time all evening, emotion finally flickered visibly across a few faces in the room. Not fear. Not status anxiety. Respect. Naomi stepped away from the microphone then. Richard looked at her as if trying to understand how the woman he dismissed at the entrance had just dismantled his entire world without ever raising her voice. Naomi met his eyes one final time. My father used to say something, she said quietly. Some rooms are never built for us. She glanced slowly across the ballroom, glowing gold beneath the chandeliers. So I bought the building instead. An hour later, the ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. The orchestra had stopped playing sometime after the acquisition announcement, and now only low conversations drifted beneath the chandeliers while exhausted waiters quietly cleared untouched champagne glasses from linen-covered tables. The massive digital screens still glowed softly above the room, but the bright promotional graphics praising Whitmore Biotech had disappeared, replaced instead with formal corporate statements scrolling across financial feeds. Reporters remained crowded near the exits, speaking urgently into cameras while executives huddled in tense circles whispering behind raised hands. Nobody laughed anymore. Near the center of the ballroom, Richard Whitmore sat alone at a table that had once been surrounded by investors eager for his attention. His tuxedo jacket hung open now, and the untouched glass beside him reflected the dim gold light overhead. Several times people approached him as if to speak, then thought better of it and kept walking. Across the room, Claire stood near the elevators staring silently at her phone while social headlines multiplied faster than she could read them. Daniel Ross remained near the stage reviewing acquisition documents with legal advisors, though every few moments his eyes drifted toward Naomi Brooks. She stood near the far windows overlooking Manhattan, calm against the glow of the city beneath her. The storm clouds had finally broken outside. Rain no longer streaked across the glass. New York shimmered below in silver and gold beneath the midnight skyline. Naomi held a warm cup of coffee between her hands now instead of champagne. One of the younger hotel staff members had quietly brought it to her 20 minutes earlier without being asked. A small kindness, the kind her father used to notice. Behind her, soft footsteps approached slowly across the marble floor. Richard Whitmore stopped several feet away from her, suddenly looking uncertain inside his own ballroom. Naomi did not turn immediately. She simply watched the city lights flicker beyond the glass, while silence stretched between them. Richard finally cleared his throat softly. Your father, he said, quietly, was a brilliant man. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second before answering. You did not think that when he warned you. Richard lowered his gaze. For the first time that night, he had no polished response prepared. I made decisions, he admitted carefully. Bad ones. Naomi turned toward him then. There was no hatred in her face. Somehow that made standing before her even harder for him. You made profitable ones, she corrected softly. Richard looked older under the dimmed ballroom lights than he had earlier that evening standing beneath applause and cameras. I cannot change what happened, he said. Naomi studied him quietly for a moment. No, she answered. But you could have acknowledged it before tonight. Richard nodded faintly, unable to argue. Across the ballroom, several employees from the catering staff were quietly gathering trays near the service hallway. A young black waitress paused for half a second while looking toward Naomi, standing beside the windows. Their eyes met briefly. The waitress smiled first. Small. Proud. Naomi returned the smile gently. Richard noticed it too. He looked away afterward. Naomi stepped past him calmly, heels moving softly across the marble floor, while conversations lowered automatically, as she passed through the ballroom one final time. Nobody stopped her now. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Near the elevators, Daniel caught up beside her holding a folder of preliminary transition reports. "The board wants an emergency meeting tomorrow morning," he said carefully. Naomi nodded once. 8 o'clock. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "your father would have been proud tonight." Naomi looked toward the closed ballroom doors behind them, where Richard Whitmore still stood alone beneath fading chandelier light. "I did not do this for revenge," she replied softly. "I did it so the next Harold Brooks does not disappear unnoticed." The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. Warm light spilled across the polished floor around her feet. Naomi stepped inside alone, the city skyline reflecting faintly against the mirrored walls behind her. Outside, the ballroom remained silent as the